volume.
Now you need to get it closer. Point it at
Like me? Okay. Okay. Well, my name is Mohammed Bennis. I'm a third-year PhD student in the art history department. I study Islamic art and manuscript arts in particular. It's kind of loud upstairs, so bear with me. Can you guys hear me? Especially Judy in the back. Can you hear me? We good? Okay. Okay, if I start trailing off. Yeah. Motion it. I think a good way to start this presentation is to talk about the IU collections, because I think 99% of the illustrations you'll be seeing in this presentation are actually drawn from IU collections. So between the Lilly Library of Rare Books and Manuscripts and between the IU Art Museum right here, there are also some works in the Kinsey Institute, but between those two major institutes, we actually have a couple dozen really good works, both great examples of calligraphy and Persian painting. So if you guys ever get a chance, by all means, come to the museum, especially after this presentation. You can go up to the next floor and look at some of the works, and I'll point out which ones are there. Or on another day, when the Lilly Library is open, you can go to the Lilly Library and check these out as well. We have manuscript forms and single-page folios. So maybe we can move on to the next slide, and we can kind of dive into here. This illustration is the only one that we don't have here. That's from, I think that's in the Topkapı Palace Museum collection. It's from a 16th century manuscript of the life of the Prophet Muhammad. So right there you have the Prophet Muhammad and the angel Gabriel swooping in and giving him, revealing to him revelation. So, one of the main driving factors of book illumination and calligraphy was really the Quran. So the Quran is believed to be the actual word of God revealed to the Prophet Muhammad. So if you want to think of the Quran as a relic, a very sacred relic that he left behind, almost his miraculous relic, copies of the Quran can be viewed in this way. So because the actual word of God was so valued, calligraphy really took off, because in Islamic religious texts, you're really not supposed to be depicting images and figural images, so you won't see them in the mosque context, or you won't usually see them in the Quranic context. So if you're going to copy a copy of the Quran and read it and live your life by it, you want that Quran to be copied in a good script. So this is what developed calligraphy. And once calligraphy kind of achieved this high status of art, then the book arts in general that spilled over to the book arts in general, and the book arts and everything involved in it, illumination, bookbinding, paper making, painting, all became these desired art forms. So that's why we're going to begin with calligraphy and Quranic calligraphy in particular, and a couple of Quran examples, and then move on to some illustrated manuscript examples, because this is kind of the flow of popularity in book arts in the Islamic world. So Quran literally means recitations. And as I said, it's believed to be the word of God. And some important vocabulary we need to know going forward is surah, so chapter, and ayah, or verse, which literally means sign. So each chapter is made out of verses. And during the time of the Prophet Muhammad, these weren't actually all codified and put together in codex format, and that didn't happen until the second Caliph Uthman. That's going to make it pop. So next slide. So around 650, all of the revelations that came to the Prophet Muhammad after his death were put together in the codex format, and basically in the format that we know it today, and in the organization that we know it to be today. So Uthman, after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, got a committee together. Can you guys still hear me? Got a committee together, and they decided to arrange the Quran from longest chapters to shortest chapters, and this is kind of the arrangement we have today. And when we think about the early years of Islam, if you will, and the early years of the revelation, because everything wasn't recorded in one single place, surahs or chapters would be recorded here and there. They would be recorded on these various different materials. And this is several centuries before the advent of paper coming to the Islamic world. So we're looking at very early materials would include scapulae, so a shoulder blade, a nice flat surface to write upon, and occasionally papyrus and bark, etc. But once things got a little more organized and papyrus became increasingly available and leather became increasingly available and the book format kind of stuck, then we have more of these transitional materials being used from about the 7th to the 10th century. So papyrus, parchment, leather, vellum, etc. And we actually have examples of all of these in the IU collection. So that example of papyrus right there, you can find in the Lilly Library, and both the Lilly Library and the IU Art Museum have examples of papyrus. Next slide. So from the 10th century onwards, paper is the most available and desirable material. And but before that, papyrus was used most often. But you can not papyrus, sorry. Parchment. But parchment is leather and animal skin, so you can imagine how expensive that would be especially to transcribe a whole Quran on it. So once paper came along, especially after the Battle of Talas in 750, after that paper kind of slowly moved westwards to be more popular in the central lands of Islamdom. And after paper came along, people really stopped using parchment because it was so expensive and hard to get a hold of. So the paper revolution is really what brought about all of the calligraphic revolution as well, because up until the 10th century, you really have one or two calligraphic styles, the Kufic style, which we'll be seeing in a second. But after that, because paper is so much easier to write on for calligraphers, many more styles, or scripts as we like to call them, developed from there on. So, and paper, even the word paper comes from Chinese hogdus, and it's about the same in Turkish and Persian as well. So paper making really came from China after the War of Talas. So I just want to briefly talk about some of the writing implements. Here we have reed pens. Sometimes if you're transcribing larger works, you would use wooden pens or bamboo pens, but the reed pen is usually the most common because it's the perfect size. It's not too big, it's not too small, and reed was very available across the Islamic world. And the cutting of the reed pen is actually very important because if you cut the nib of your pen incorrectly, you will have bad calligraphy. So your calligraphy is only as nice as the nib of your pen is. So there are poems, etc., written to express the importance of the cutting of the nib of the pen. So that should kind of highlight how important that nib is. And the important thing is also to keep a little dent in it so that it holds the ink as you're writing. So when we think about medieval manuscripts, we usually think about European versions transcribed with a quill, whereas in the Islamic world, 99% of the time it's going to be a reed pen and not a quill pen. And one thing to note going forward about calligraphy, Islamic calligraphy in particular, is that it's based on a system of proportions. So these little dots are what we call rhomboids, and the aleph is actually, once you draw a perfect circle around the aleph, that should be 7 rhomboids high and 7 rhomboids wide. And this is kind of the basis of the proportions for the script. So across scripts, you'll see about the same proportions. So each B, for instance, this is a B. Here. A little dot at the bottom. Each B will be 7 rhomboids long. So 6 in the middle, and 1 afterwards. And then you can imagine the rest of the script being based on this. And at the end, we'll see one example of how this is kind of worked out through practice. But you'll see a lot of practice sheets based on this as well. So if you see a sheet full of all of these unnecessary dots, that's probably a practice sheet. So this is an early folio from a Quran that we have here in the Lilly Library, and this is actually made up of 14 folios, and it's really difficult to find a complete Quran from this period because a lot of times they weren't completely bound. So when you're looking at parchment Qurans, because they would become so thick, they were usually just bound between two pieces of wood rather than sewn together. And even if they were, it usually came apart fairly quickly. So whenever you find one of these in a library collection or a museum collection, it's usually going to be about 20 folios, 30 folios at most. So in the library here we have one folio, and then, or the museum, we have one folio, and at the library we have 14 folio compilation. So this is from about the 9th century, so not the very earliest, and we can tell by some of the diacritics, etc. But this is the 49th, between the 49th and the 70th chapter, and you can see from the chapter heading here, we have a chapter heading here in gold. So the way the Quranic manuscripts are arranged and designed is by using golds to mark the important spots in the manuscript. So chapter headings and ayah markers. So at the end of each verse, you'll have a gold marker, such as these 3 dots here. So that's an ayah marker. And then every time you get to a larger ayah, so in every 10 ayah increment, so that you know you've come to either the 10th or the 20th or the 30th ayah, we have these ayah markers that have the ayah number in them. If you want to. So for instance, this ayah marker here is the 50th. It's Khamsun, and it makes it very easy for the reader. It says it right there. And then the surah heading, in this early Quran, instead of having the actual name of the surah, it has the first couple words from the surah. So the inquirer asked. And then to make it more easier for people to locate which surah they're looking at, or when they're coming to the beginning of a surah or a chapter, there are also these decorative finials, right, in the margins. And so these are kind of early signs of how margins are going to be used later on. But it's also important to note the importance of gold. Not only is it precious material, but it also kind of indicates the presence of holiness, because the Quran is kind of considered this light that enlightens people because it's the sacred text. So you can understand how the use of gold would further sanctify the text. Actually, can we go back one more? I also wanted to point out these red dots. Here and here. And those can be a number of things. They can be short vowels or vocalizations or nonations. And you'll notice anyone who has a little bit of familiarity with the Arabic script, you'll notice that it's missing a lot of the letter markers. So your Kaf would have 2 dots, your Nun would have 1 dot, and this is because it's an early form of the text. So we're looking at 9th century, so by now it still hasn't developed completely, but there are some really neat developments that you don't see in really early Qurans, but you see in later ones, such as this marker here, this little line. It marks a Nun, or the N letter. And if you look at a manuscript from 100 years earlier, for instance, just a century earlier, you wouldn't see that. So this is kind of this cool transitional period where they're starting to, the calligraphers and scribes are starting to experiment with actually marking the letters so it's a little easier to read. So another thing that's important about analyzing a manuscript is looking at what materials are used. So other than the paper or the writing surface, papyrus, parchment, or paper, we have the various inks or paints that are used, either in illumination or in painting. So lapis lazuli is something that we'll be seeing a lot of. It's usually used in chapter heading illuminations, especially, and it's used quite frequently in Quran illuminations in general. There's also cinnabar. Verdigris is malicious material because it eats away at the paper upon which it's painted. So we'll see a couple of examples where the verdigris has eaten away at our manuscript paper. And charcoal is used primarily for ink. And then, of course, we've already started to look at the use of gold in these manuscripts. Saffron makes a great yellow. It's a good dye. So, I guess we can move forward. So this is from one of my favorite manuscripts. It's in the Lilly Library, and it has a wonderful gold-painted binding. We think it's original to when it was made in the 16th century, and we actually think that this juz, or one of 30 parts of Quran, might have been made for Shah Tahmasp of the Safavid Empire in around 1571, because there are other parts of this manuscript in other collections that have been dated and signed by calligraphers. This one isn't dated, which is why it's kind of up in the air, but because we can match it up with other parts of the Quran, we think that it might be from Shah Tahmasp's collection. So that's really interesting. But here we see the extensive use of gold and the extensive use of lapis lazuli in the chapter heading. And one of the interesting things about these chapter headings in Islamic manuscripts is that when you think about it, when you start a chapter or a new section in a manuscript in a medieval manuscript, for instance, we usually use large letters, a large capital letter to usually illuminated and decorated and painted large capital letter to indicate the beginning of a chapter. Whereas in Arabic script, there are no capital letters. So this type of format is much more suitable because you can't really start with a capital letter. And you'll already notice in the script here that it's much more developed from the previous script. If you want to skip back just one more, or maybe two more, you can see how the script here, even for a native Arabic speaker, this is a little difficult to read because it doesn't have the letter markers. It's very angular, and it's very, for our modern tastes, for those of us who do know the Arabic script, it's very simple in a way. So if we go back to this manuscript from the 16th century, you can see how much it's developed and evolved to be more readable. And actually, in this example, there are two different scripts being used. So, script in black is the Nasc script, and I like to call that kind of Times New Roman. It's the easiest one to read. It's the most commonly used, and it's commonly used in Quran manuscripts because it's so easy to read. And later on, when you're thinking about reading the Quran, you have to imagine how difficult it might be, especially if you're not a native speaker of Arabic. So you really want your script to be easy to read by this time. So the Nasc script is perfect for that because it's not like other scripts where all of the curves aren't indicated. It's very easy, very crisp, and each letter and the vocalization is marked right where it needs to be. But the script in gold, you can see in the middle and at the bottom, is actually huluf, and that's kind of just a variation of Nas. But one way to beautify your Quran manuscript is to use gold and illumination and other decorations. But another way to beautify it is to use different scripts, especially if you're a calligrapher trying to show off your abilities to work within different scripts. So this is one way to make this manuscript more precious in a way. It's more interesting to look at if you're enjoying this manuscript that you may own, and it's easier to read. And another interesting thing about this is that you can see corrections in red. And you can imagine when a scribe is writing a manuscript, they're human, they make mistakes, and all you have to do is go in afterwards, and if you notice a mistake, write it out. And this is an example of the acidic qualities of verdigris. In a lot of manuscripts from especially the 16th and 17th century, we see painters using verdigris because it was, in a lot of places, the only kind of green available that you can use. And verdigris is made out of copper, and copper is acidic, as is verdigris, so it eats away at your painting. But it does produce a really nice green. So in this example from a page from the Rasnama, this also is in the Lilly Library, we can see how the verdigris has eaten away. Here, these little spots here where it's kind of eaten away. And this is an interesting, aside from the fact that it shows us the acidic qualities of verdigris, it's also a good example of a chapter heading. So, so far we've looked at Quranic examples and examples of fine calligraphy, etc. But here we can see an example of fine painting and calligraphy. And this is, again, another version of the chapter heading that we looked at that has extensive use of gold and lapis lazuli, which gives it that blue. And this is a chapter heading from a book of Kings by Firdousi, or Shahnameh, from the 16th century and produced in Iran. And in here, it's kind of hard to see with the lighting in here, but you can see, if you look at it closely, it says Shahnameh in there. So the book of Luhras. So every book, or every king in the Shahnameh gets its own chapter heading. And what better way to begin a chapter but include a portrait of the king that's being covered. So this is Luhras here. And it's an enthronement scene, so people are coming and pledging their allegiance to him as he becomes enthroned. And another interesting thing about Safavid manuscripts, so this is probably Safavid, Iran, 16th century, is that a lot of Safavids are represented with this Taja Haidari. It's this little stub that sticks out of their turbans, and it's usually red. So if you see a manuscript laying around with these figures with these turbans and the knob hanging, sticking out, that's probably Safavid in origin. And another interesting thing about this manuscript is that it uses nastalik. And since we're talking about poetry, or we were talking about poetry, nastalik is the favored script for poetry. So a lot of Persian poetry manuscripts would be inscribed in nastalik rather than nas, because that's kind of more associated with the Quran. And nastalik is a very Persian script. It's not used as much in other places. Maybe in the Ottoman Empire, but usually if you start seeing this script, for instance, you probably know you're looking at poetry. Another dead giveaway that you're looking at poetry are the columns. So it's rhymed couplets here, so this couplet rhymes with this, and this rhymes with this. So you still read it in this direction, but just knowing that these will rhyme with one another. So as soon as you see this script, or as soon as you see those columns, the text divided into these columns, you're looking at poetry. So you don't even have to really be able to read it to understand a baseline of what you're looking at. This would not be a Quran. This is actually on display up in the galleries right now if you want to take a look at it. Not right now, once I finish. But once I'm done, you can take a look at it in person. And it's one of my favorite paintings from our collection here at the IU Art Museum. It's from Mughal India. So I think 16th century, possibly early 7th century. And it's to elaborate on our theme of poetry. It's probably a depiction of the poet Firdousi. He's shown here with his calligraphic materials. So a little, this will be to hold your pen, and then there's a small inkwell here, and then a little box, perhaps for a book. And these are usually used for Qurans and Quran stamps, but he may also be using this to indicate that he's either composing or reading a book. So this might also be the scribe, but chances are it's Firdousi if it's included in a copy of the Shahnameh. So Firdousi is the author of the Shahnameh, the great book of Kings, in which the Luhrasnameh is located. And we don't have the rest of the manuscript of this. We just have this folio. But once you read the text in the margins, it's actually text from the Shahnameh. So this is probably a folio from a Shahnameh. And one of the interesting aspects of kind of these luxury illustrated manuscripts in the Islamic world are their use of decorated papers. So here we have a great example of decorated paper, and I was looking at this again today and thinking about the way the paper might have been cut up, and it seems like the designs kind of go over the paper here, so it doesn't cut off, but the designs all cut off right here in the middle. So it seems like the way you would use this paper is it would have come in kind of a large quantity, maybe a large roll, that already had these square rectangular areas cut out. And then you can imagine the next folio would have been maybe cut from whatever continued here. So We also see the extensive use of lapis lazuli and gold illumination as well. So gold illumination just isn't used in Qurans, but also in illustrated manuscripts. So that's another way we can extend the book arts into the secular realm as well. And this is also from Mughal India. It's a portrait of Aurangzeb, or a later Mughal king who wasn't actually all that popular, but here's his portrait. And this kind of format with the king sitting in what appears to be a sort of window. So sitting in this window. This is actually a dagger that he has his hand on. It's typical Mughal daggers with these two ends sticking out. He's wearing a whole lot of jewelry. And this format of the ruler in a window, kind of in profile, is actually borrowed from Europe. And what's interesting about the Mughal Empire is that a lot of prints were coming in and out of India from Europe through trade. So from the 16th century onwards, you do see a lot of this European influence in Mughal paintings, including the attention to detail with facial features. So in a lot of Persian paintings, you won't see so much portraiture per se. It would usually be the idealized version of a king, for instance, with Lohras. But in Mughal India, they pay a lot more attention to portraiture. I think there is one more. I want to end on our website. Just one more. And this is an interactive website that we put together when we had our exhibit here a couple of years ago on book arts, and it's still up. It will continue to be up, and you can go through each manuscript and each major work of art that we have here, one by one at the comfort of your home, and look at these, enjoy these works at home as well. So I encourage you guys to visit this website, and I guess maybe I can open us up for some questions. Do we have time for a few questions? Yeah, so if you want to stick around and ask me questions, you may. But otherwise, thanks for coming.
I'm just interested in the reed pens. You know, in the West, you would cut your own as they start to wear out. In this tradition, is there somebody who cuts them for you, or does the person who is the scribe cut their own?
I think the scribe cuts his own for the most part.
As they get wet, they get soggy, they get soft, even as you're writing one manuscript, so you would then recut.
Yeah, and I think it's also it's definitely part of the training process. So as you're learning, as you're an apprentice, maybe if you're a really big master, maybe you don't have to cut your own.